This podcast is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. If you'd like to help expand our programming, head to patreon.com/talkstarwars and become a TSW patron. You'll receive exclusive podcasts, access to a VIP Facebook group, monthly prize draws, Facebook Live sessions, and much, much more. Head to patreon.com/talkstarwars and become a TSW patron today, and the force will be with you always. Welcome to TSW Feature Comms.
And I want to get tahu.
What was that again?
Feature-length audio commentaries for the Star Wars movies
Lord Vader.
and beyond.
Press play.
It's a track!
We would be honored if you would join us. This is madness.
Hey everyone, it's Mark. This is a unusual edition of TSW Feature Comms because I'm flying solo. It's been an absolute nightmare trying to get the schedules synced up with the guys to get something together for this release window. But don't worry, we're not going to mess with the schedule. And the next film on the docket is Rogue One. This is going to be something of a special edition because I'm going to look at the pre-special edition version of Star Wars. This is the bonus DVD that was included with the original DVD release of Star Wars Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. Each movie came with its original version on DVD, which I believe were direct ports across from the Laserdisc. So if you had the Laserdisc back in the day, this would have been the copy that you were enjoying. They're not great, but I think as a trip down memory lane, they will be very interesting to view. So I thought we could do that together. So this is how it's going to work. I'm going to give you a cue in just a moment. The cue will be 3, 2, 1, pause. That's your cue to go off, grab your DVD, load it into your DVD player, press play, and then pause. And zero out your play counter by hitting track back or rewind until you get to zeros. And then you'll be ready to hit play. And when you do, hit play on both the DVD and the podcast, and we'll be perfectly in sync to walk through this movie together. I wouldn't worry too much if you didn't want to watch the film. It's probably going to be quite interesting. It's more going to be a stream of consciousness than anything else. I'll be talking about some of the narrative stuff and some of the filmmaking stuff, and I'll just be bouncing around left, right, and centre. So I won't worry too much. If you're not watching the movie, you can probably still get something out of listening along. It'll be interesting, I'm sure, to hear me try and speak for 2 hours non-stop. So here we go. Right, you ready? You ready to dart off and get your DVDs and get yourself set up? So here's your cue. 3, 2, 1, pause. Okay, and we are go with Star Wars. I'm going to reduce my audio to barely perceptible levels. This does not look good already. The quality of the image is actually quite poor. Lots of movement in the frame. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, we call this weaving in the industry. There you go, Star Wars. So this is before A New Hope. This is even before the episode number. This would have been the version of the film I saw in the cinema when I was a 5-year-old boy. So the opening crawl. It's a period of civil war, rebel spaceships striking from a hidden base. We now know that story. We've seen it. Rogue One. That's the next episode of this very podcast. Rogue One, a Star Wars story. So this now we can do in IMO. I could probably do this opening crawl on my phone, actually. But back in the day, they had to put... This was done a black background with yellow writing on somebody's driveway. And then they pulled the camera down over it. The things they had to do, set in type on a black background, and then comping this thing in post-production, is quite inventive. Amazing. It always fills me with so much joy to see these opening crawls roll up. Such a shame they didn't use them on the Star Wars story movies. But there you go. So this is possibly the most iconic shot in the history of cinema. The pan down through space. Beautiful score by Williams. And there we have Tatooine. Little did we know it's become so important, this planet. So there's the Tantive 4, the blockade runner, pursued by a seemingly never-ending Imperial Star Destroyer. That must have been stunning to have seen that in a theatre for the first time ever. Amazing. So we know now that this is about an hour after the events of Rogue One. Incredible. The 3PO being followed by another protocol droid. I'd love to know a bit more about that character. So we discussed recently R2 and how R2 was very much the hero of Star Wars, and 3PO, even though he was nervous and would rather keep out of trouble, never abandoned his friends. It must have been absolutely staggering to have been on that set for Rogue One, seeing those uniforms, see those white walls. I wonder if anyone remembers there was a cover of a magazine that had Hayden Christensen standing in the corridor of the Tantive 4 in these Jedi robes from Revenge of the Sith. I'll have to try and dig that out because it posed a lot of questions about his connection to that ship. And of course, here he is now coming through the door any second after these stormtroopers. When I first saw that cover, I thought he's been there before. Some of these effects, some of these costumes, the new stormtroopers, the ones that look like they're made by Apple, look much more robust than these. These costumes, you can see their lower leg parts splitting open as they walk. It's just, it doesn't ruin the movie, but there's just these things that kind of stand out now in the light of modern film making techniques that make it seem cheap. So there we go, the greatest entrance of all time. Lord Vader. So that lightsaber had done some work, just an hour previous. It's amazing how these new perspectives give you new insight into these films. Iconic moment. This movie's loaded with them. So 3PO seeing Leia. Now, bearing in mind, just an hour or so before, a couple of hours before, these droids are at the Massassi Temple on Yavin. So is 3PO lying about who Leia is? Is there programming in place that prevents him from revealing certain things? I know that in the Dr. Aphra comic books, there are 3PO and R2 have counterparts called 000 and BT something or other, psychopathic droids. And Dr. Aphra installs some code that prevents 000, the protocol droid, from becoming bloodthirsty, because they're actually Imperial torture droids, which is nice. So I wonder if 3PO has some sort of programming that prevents him revealing too much. Now, this chap that Vader is killing, that is the guy who takes the transmission to Leia on the bridge of the Tantive 4 at the end of Rogue One. It's the same character. Carrie cutting a swathe through modern filmmaking. Amazing. She must have known that her odds were really quite poor of surviving this. Our heroes getting ready to go on their mission. R2 does not miss a beat in these movies. He is absolutely on point constantly. Always, ever the hero. And 3PO has to be motivated by a nearby blaster shot. This was a great idea. And now, unfortunately, Seth MacFarlane's ruined this moment for me, because I can't watch this scene without thinking of Family Guy. Are we paying by the laser blast? Or is this another example of imperial arrogance? Also, I guess there's room to speculate that it might be the will of the Force, although we don't like that. That's a cheat. Star Wars fandom doesn't like that. Spoilers, father and daughter meeting. Carrie was such a beautiful woman. So we get a bit of a hint here that they may have history, or she may have a reputation. Mercy mission. I'm sure Claudia Gray has covered this in her recent Leia book. But it's interesting to see how Vader views her, a member of the Senate. She's very much working from within. And we know that Mon Mothma is trying to pull all the different rebel cells together into this alliance. Just an hour ago, that was starting to coalesce, and a few of the holdouts, like Saw Gerrera, had fallen by the wayside. So her particular rebel cell was clearly working from inside the Imperial Senate, alongside her father Bail. Now, I wonder how much Vader is thinking about Tatooine at this point, and how this hideous planet from his past has popped up once more. This is one of those shots that really benefits from HD, because this the droids slowly moving through the desert now just looks just so full of noise. It is barely watchable. Now, of course, they've both been here before. 3PO started his life here. Clearly that memory wipe Bail instructed Captain Antilles to carry out at the end of Revenge of the Sith took its effect. And as we know from George, R2 is the only character that has total recall of everything that happens in these films. That's an iconic image. R2 and 3PO standing next to each other. It's just like one of those great design achievements. Just that image is just incredibly iconic. So gorgeous to see those two droids next to each other. Evocative of a certain period in my life, I think, my childhood. Wonderful stuff. So off they go. Different directions. I'm sure there's an anecdote here about 3PO being, or Anthony Daniels in the costume, stumbling across some Bedouin tribesmen out in this desert in Tunisia and startling them with his gold appearance. And of course that Great Dragon skeleton, that has to be out there somewhere still. It's great stuff. Summoning his own doom. Another shot, this canyon where R2 first encounters the Jawas, certainly it improves when you get to the special editions, when you get to the HD versions. It's beautiful. It's been recolor timed. It's absolutely crisp. This looks like a completely different scene to me now, this version on DVD, and this is the argument I make about why people don't actually want this version in HD. I think we're asking for something new. I don't think we're asking for this. The Jawas are absolutely fantastic. Paul's favourite characters? Another iconic image from Star Wars, the Jawa leveling the blaster at R2. The little Kenner action figures of the Jawas are absolutely gorgeous. I've got a new one from the 40th anniversary range, and even though it's blinding, it's kind of something gets lost. The simplicity of those original toys is just so charming. So the face of the galaxy is now resting on the shoulders of these tiny Jawas. Everything the Rogues achieved in Rogue One is now being carried through the desert by these tiny little stinky creatures. Amazing. Love their chatter. Something about the way John Williams scores this as well. I'd love to speak to Paul about this at length, but there's something playful in the way he scores this scene. This scene, if it was scored by somebody without John Williams' sensibilities, it may have been a little bit more sinister, maybe a little bit more threatening, especially when this little droid's been kidnapped and enslaved. But Williams manages to cut through some of that tension with this beautiful, playful little tune. Death Star droid. There's a couple of moments in here that I've noticed certain fan edits, despecialized editions, have taken liberties with, especially when it comes to 3PO, R5D4, one of the classics. 3PO's eyes blink on and off. Is Matt Keegan's favourite, Gonk. Yeah, 3PO's eyes blink on and off in a moment during the reunion here between him and R2D2. And some of the despecialized editions have corrected that, and they've left the eyes on unbroken. But there's something in that blink. There's something there that gives an already quizzical looking 3PO another look of complete astonishment. He cannot believe his luck. Him and his friend have been reunited. It's just that little look on his face, I think, is wonderful. This shot as well, with the stormtroopers now investigating the downed escape pod. Beautifully, beautifully judged. Just the right amount of troops, one due back. Loading it up the way George did in the special editions with additional dewbacks and that ship taken off unneeded. But that sandcrawler slowly making its way over the dunes. The revision in the special edition, absolutely on point. Gorgeous edition, really great effect. Shows how enormous this mobile marketplace is. And I think it really adds something. So, not everything he did in the special editions was bad. I think probably the good outweighs the bad considerably. That's Paul's favourite line. Here comes the window cleaner. So here we go. They're setting out their impromptu marketplace now on the Lars homestead. All of these droids are fantastic. I can't think what the big dome one's practical application is, but they are quite amazing. So much effort went into. I heard Guillermo del Toro talking about the appeal of Star Wars, particularly to him, who he does extensive art design on his projects, and he said that Star Wars really caught his imagination by having this weathered, used, lived-in look. And it has informed an awful lot of science fiction, but we have to try and remember this is the first time it was done, really. Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, they had shiny spaceships. It looked like everything had just been manufactured yesterday, but this stuff looks like it's been around for generations, especially the tall black droid behind 3PO. It just looks beaten, battered, and Like it's been around for decades. There's a reunion now between 3PO and Uncle Owen. So we talk often about how Obi-Wan doesn't remember R2, but Owen doesn't seem to remember 3PO. You would think the designation would give him away. I understand, of course, that he wasn't gold at the time, but shows how these people ignore their tools. The droids are essentially tools. They're utilities. A crucial moment now for fate. Is R2 strong in the Force? Does he construct this failure? Or is just another one of those episodes of dumb luck? Saving his friend. Wonderful. There's a little recycled shot in there. The editors on this movie had to recycle quite a lot of footage. They said sometimes we're going to see one in a moment with the Tusken Raider attack. Sometimes they even had to take it right up to the camera flash, the stop of the camera running. So they used every square inch of footage. And in that droid lineup, there was a shot where we cut back to R2 that we'd already seen used as he stands and turns his head towards 3PO. They reused that shot again. And you can tell it's the same shot because R5D4 is just over R2's shoulder. And then we cut back to Luke and R5D4 is still smoking in front of him. So the editors really had to go some to get enough footage to work with. I think George sailed a little close to the wind with his coverage. This workshop, of course, was recreated for Attack of the Clones, and it was a sneak preview into that movie was on one of the VHS box sets way back in the day. So even before this DVD came out, we saw the new version of this workshop, this garage, on a VHS special look inside Attack of the Clones. I think that might have been the last time I purchased these movies on tape. It's a wonderful moment. So this is the first call to action for Luke. The princess in distress. This shot, this footage, when Carrie first recorded it against a black screen, she didn't have the hood up, and when they did the comp, basically her hair disappeared into the background. She said she looked like Yul Brynner. So they had to reshoot it, which is how she managed to recall that dialogue all the way up to current day, all the way up to her sad departure. It's a wonderful moment. I know Paul and I have had discussions previously about how R2 managed to capture that footage of Leia and get all the different angles. And in my headcanon, the technology used to capture an image like that will register the displacement of space around the figure and measure those elements and use that to construct a three-dimensional figure rather than just film a two-dimensional image of Leia. It's actually scanning the space around her to work out how it relates to the space around it, the reproduction that is. He's a little trickster, that R2. And Luke is a little bit naive and gullible. So this location, I mean, there's a combination here between on location shooting and sets on a soundstage. But the actual troglodyte home, domicile, is a place in Tunisia called the City Driss. It's a hotel. The cave painting is still there in this alcove, and there is still some of the decorative adornments that the set decorators used and placed around the location. They're still in place. It is a little bit fan-centric now, though. It's when you go there are posters on the wall celebrating Star Wars. It's really, and who can blame them, trading on its connection to Star Wars. But yeah, it's not something you can actually go and visit without getting caught up in all the tourist trappings. So this can't be the first time they've had this conversation about Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan had to have been a presence in Luke's early life, and some things happened that's made Owen extraordinarily protective of the boy. He probably feels that old Ben is more of a hazard to the boy now than anything else, rather than just some sort of lone protector, some sentinel out in the desert. And of course, Owen and Beru based their understanding of Vader's fall on stories they've heard, presumably from Ben, and not from personal experience, because they didn't really know him. This might be my favourite moment in the movie. The concept, what it says about Luke, the score, everything about this moment is perfect. The colour-timed HD version is my preferred version, but this is my favourite moment in A New Hope. Beautiful. The words of Yoda from Empire Strikes Back just rattle around in my head, always as he looked away to the future, to the horizon. We see one of those speeders later on in Mos Eisley. This moment, my wife is very fond of pointing out that this is where the first commercial break was when this used to air on TV. She was subjected to rewatching this with her brother as children every Sunday, and this is where they put the commercial. I remember that. The world building, these casual references to things that we haven't experienced yet, we haven't witnessed yet. The world building in this story is just fantastic. And I think that's why we get swept along in it, because we're asked to just keep up. Looks like the old Treadwell droid in the background there hasn't quite woken up yet. The actress that played Beru had her voice replaced. I believe she was an English actress, and they overdubbed in ADR. The land speeder effect here is done by hanging a mirror down, which reflects the road back up, and then tidying that up in post a little bit. But it's not bulletproof, the effect in this film, but it is pretty impressive what they managed to achieve. And these banthas, this is all in California, I believe, in Death Valley, in California. Elephants dressed up. Elephant cosplay. I get lost in this. I get lost completely. I love it so much. So Luke, looking for adventure, gets himself a little bit out of depth. Now, this is the moment where the editors had to take the last few frames and rock them backwards and forwards. So if you see, it's not quite natural. It's a bit like probably the world's first GIF, or GIF, depending on how you pronounce it. Using every frame of footage right up to the camera stop. This will be my preferred version of this scene with R2 visible in that little cave and not obscured by nonsensical rocks. And the original Crate Dragon call as well. This has been changed a number of times. And this is something Obi-Wan's used in John Jackson Miller's book. I believe Obi-Wan uses that as a tool to scare people off, scare the Sand People off. Also quite like the idea that Obi-Wan is somewhat aware of what's going to happen now. This is a great hero reveal. How wonderful. I like the idea that Obi-Wan has been waiting for this moment for decades. And this might be the first time that he's put those Jedi robes on in years. I think I would quite like that if we ever saw an Obi-Wan movie, that we saw him in sort of utility clothing, like cargo pants and a jacket, and something that makes him look cool, and something that he doesn't stand out because he's wearing the robes of a Jedi Knight. He's probably going to be quite obvious. So I like the idea that this might be the first time Obi-Wan's put those robes on thinking, well, this is it. Everything's about to start. He's using the Force. He's seeing the possible future off on the pathway. That must be the moment he's waited for. That look on his face. Now, Alec Guinness, his performance in this movie is so incredibly nuanced. You would think the guy understood every single minute element of what was in this script and what was to come. But of course it wasn't the case, because George managed to retcon quite a lot of what came out of this film. By the time we even get to Empire Strikes Back, there was a lot of rewriting and reworking of history. If Sir Alec Guinness's performance hadn't been as delicate and as nuanced as it was, George wouldn't have had that freedom. A lesser actor would deliver some of these lines as absolute truth. But Obi-Wan, Alec Guinness, manages to talk about these things in a way where you could take it as being absolute truth, could be a little bit of a lie, could be that he's misremembering. It's his reaction about hearing the name Obi-Wan. And later when he goes on to talk to Luke about Anakin, his father, being killed by Vader, it's all stuff that's so nuanced, it gave George room to move. So here we are now in Obi-Wan's hovel. So Obi-Wan's talking somewhat in generalities here about Owen's position on Anakin. The two didn't really know each other. Owen's understanding of Anakin must have been through stories he was told by Shmi. That's where Luke got these small-minded worldview, I think. I just want to stay here and do my work until this iconic weapon is produced to propel him on his way. There it is. The first time we ever saw the lightsaber. Wonderful. So as I'm recording this, we are just about a day away from the second trailer for The Last Jedi. And that lightsaber's still doing the rounds. So there's a decision made by Obi-Wan. And Sir Alec's performance sells it as a lie. He's telling Luke what he believes he needs to hear in order to motivate him. Imagine if Obi-Wan had told him the truth. The biggest bad in the galaxy is your dad. What does the boy do with that? No, he's told him something. He's made a decision to tell him a part truth to motivate him to a certain end. And that may have caused a rift that we later get a glimpse of in Return of the Jedi. Luke starts to question his masters. Obi-Wan knows completely he has no choice now. The game's afoot. There we go. The young man who was looking off to the horizon, looking for adventure, when it arrives in his life, he wants to walk away from it. The hero's journey, ladies and gentlemen. So at this point, is Obi-Wan deciding to leave whether Luke comes or not? Or is he going to put his trust in the Force to motivate Luke? So the round table, not the TSW round table, but the Imperial round table, there he is. Grand Moff Wulf Tarkin. Some of those empty seats, one of those would have been occupied by Krennic. This was Gary Witter's insight. Most likely the seat to the left of Tarkin would have been Director Krennic's. I do love the way Rogue One recontextualizes the weakness in the Death Star. Rob called this way before the film came out, that this would have been a trap set by somebody inside. And of course it's Galen placing the weakness in there to be found, all the while pretending to be committed to the Imperial cause. I also wonder if Vader would have been anywhere near the Death Star had the events of Rogue One not played out. It seems as though he was assigned to this mission by Palpatine purely because of the failures of Krennic. A pretty effective duo, Tarkin and Vader. It's quite interesting that it's been a while since I've really noticed anything different from the special editions. I haven't noticed too much of a loss at the moment. Of course, a HD version would be greatly welcome, but I haven't missed any of the bells and whistles yet. Something tells me we're about to see a much better version of the entrance into Mos Eisley than the one we currently live with the special editions. But so far, I haven't really missed a great deal. There's something to be said for the colour timing. This is an incredibly, incredibly powerful moment. So we're still really, but maybe it's been expanded upon in new canon, but I'm still a little unclear as to who's responsible for this. I know Paul Bateman likes the idea that this is the Womp Rats have come back to avenge the Womp Rat that Luke bullseyed in Beggar's Canyon. But I think it's one of those moments. Without this, Luke may not leave. Really, really powerful stuff. That's it. How do you cut someone's ties? Another purely iconic moment. Leia in this room with Vader is quite incredible. This is one of Tarkin's torture droids. I wonder if it's from the same range as BT and Treble Zero. Now, clearly Anakin hadn't learned some of the techniques that his grandson knows about mind probing. Clearly Ben Solo's a little bit ahead of the curve there. I wonder what we're about to learn about Snoke and his abilities and how that would have changed Vader's approach, were he able to simply probe Leia's mind. He would have uncovered an extraordinary amount of information. Unfortunately, that's precisely what Obi-Wan needed. So this is a very modest version of Mos Eisley seen from this precipice. The wretched hive of scum and villainy. But I do much prefer this entrance into Mos Eisley. There's that speeder I mentioned earlier. It's much more modest. It makes Mos Eisley seem like the tiny little spaceport where a smuggler like Han could move around without too much attention. These Imperials, I imagine, are a new addition to the town. You know, they're the police force now. They're looking for these escape droids, the plans. More of a prefect presence on this planet than anything else. Not completely effective, I would say. The veritable metropolis of the special editions, I think, robs Mos Eisley of some of its anonymity. If it's too much of a hustle and bustle environment, it gives it weakens some of the abilities that these characters have to move around in relative obscurity. That's just my take on it. I think that's just too busy. That's great. I love the Jew back in the background, tethered up. And now here we go. So this, one of George's most disappointing, I'm going to say failures, because George viewed this as a failure. He'd run out of money, he'd run out of time. Rick Baker worked on a lot of the masks in this scene, and it just wasn't the exotic menagerie of alien species that George imagined. And I think it may have motivated Jabba's palace, the Jabba's court in Return of the Jedi. It gave George an opportunity to go back and do something a little bit more exotic, a little bit more adventurous. He could throw more money at it, more time at developing some of these characters. And so we ended up with the monster rally that he wanted all along. Well, I think this is perfectly fine. I like the cheapness of some of these masks, just background characters. So we've got the two lucky survivors of the assault on Jeddah, Ponda Baba and Dr. Evazan. Some of these creatures, the werewolf and the Deveronian, and they're so twee. So these two have been spoiling for a fight for quite a while, and they've just survived Jeddah. You'd think they'd be a little bit more enlightened at this stage. A lot of people have a problem with these two characters popping up in Rogue One, but I really didn't. I thought it was kind of a nice little wink to the audience. And this is Obi-Wan just wanting to shut this down. It already started to get a little bit too out of hand for him. But that must do something to accelerate their schedule, because now, obviously, they've become very, very public. Again, nice and simple. Too much going on in the special edition version. This band music, jizz music, absolutely brilliant. Han's boasting. I'm sure we're going to learn some of this next year when Ron's movie drops, but Han is boasting about the Kessel Run, but he boasts that it's the ship that made the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs. Doesn't necessarily mean he was piloting it. I'm not sure what the new canon take on it is, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Han was piloting it. Is he boasting about somebody else's achievement? Maybe Beckett, maybe Lando? It's Obi-Wan proving that you don't always need the Force to manipulate somebody. You can use their own weakness against them. And for Han, that's greed. What a great idea this canteen was, this cantina. Such a great way to indicate that there's this sort of, this subculture just under the surface of what we've already learnt about. You know, we're getting caught up now, we're getting introduced to this world, and all of a sudden we're being shown just underneath the world we've shown you of Jawas and farmers is this smuggling underworld. One where this guy will do whatever he has to do to survive. This is a great moment. There's an article on the site written by long-time listener and supporter Christopher White about how this moment, it obeys the laws of the Western. That Han is justified in shooting Greedo because Greedo had already pulled his gun. And so I don't have a problem with it. I don't have a problem with Han shooting first. He moves around this underworld. He's forced into situations where he has to do what's necessary in order to survive. And Greedo knew what he was doing when he levelled that weapon at him. He knew the rules. Tarkin's looking a lot shorter here than he did in Rogue One. These two droids, I love the bickering. Great characters. So that white droid on the right of the screen now, he pops up again later in Return of the Jedi down in Jabba's palace. Obviously, things didn't pan out too well for him. So this Imperial spy, I wonder if he knew who Obi-Wan was, or if there was an APB out on the droids. I'd love to know a little bit more about that. I'm sure it's out there in canon. It's probably in a comic book somewhere. Docking Bay 94. R2 would probably do well to use those little booster rockets he's got. And this is just a fantastic set. So this is one of the images that Ralph McQuarrie used to really sell the concept to Alan Ladd Jr. and the board at Fox. The image of that ship in Docking Bay 94. Imagine seeing that huge painting by Ralph McQuarrie and have that capture your imagination. It's quite impressive. Looking forward to seeing what the Falcon really should look like in the Han Solo movie. It's all clean and tidy and effective before this scoundrel has had a chance to run it into the ground. The one thing I did not miss in this edit of the movie is the Jabba the Hutt in Docking Bay 94 scene. It's just not necessary. Completely not needed at all. We get a reference to Jabba, we get a reference in the next movie, and we meet him in the third movie. That's more than enough foreshadowing. Han squaring off against Jabba in Docking Bay 94 diminishes the threat of that character, I think. If he could just walk away from Jabba, saying, I've just picked up this charter, I can pay you later, it cheapens somewhat the threat of Jabba the Hutt in Empire when Han says, I need to take a chance and leave to settle my debt. There's an awful lot of matte lines in this edition. You see those little discoloured boxes around the ships where they've been composited into the final movie. That's one of the things a special edition of these films did really well, is tidying up those artefacts of the actual filmmaking. Great stuff. I would love at some point to see a Death Star pop out of hyperspace. So last time we were in this room, there were a bunch of dignitaries, Krennic, and it was just over Jeddah. A lot's been made of Carrie's accent in these moments, and I think they played on it a little bit in The Phantom Menace when Amidala was in Queen mode and spoke with a fake sort of British accent. Almost they were trying to go for a non-regional dialect. And I think it's part of Leia's projection at this point that she's still a Senate representative. She's continuing with the masquerade when all around her have seen through it. And that's what I think that voice is her trying to project the dignitary. And it starts to slip. A final act of defiance. So Tarkin has complete freedom to do this. He doesn't have to run this past Palpatine. Does that show how powerful Tarkin is, or does it show how disinterested Palpatine is at this stage with managing this empire that he's built? I certainly get the impression from reading Palpatine in books like Tarkin that he got himself into a position where he could go unchallenged and enter into that old Sith temple beneath the Jedi temple and lose himself in the dark side. Almost as though that were his objective. Absolute power gives him the freedom to take that next step. And what we're learning about Palpatine, and he's looking into the unknown regions and perhaps his connection to Snoke and what Snoke may represent, it certainly appears that everything that we saw with the Galactic Civil War was a means to an end for Palpatine. He was actually just trying to achieve something else. Perhaps bipartisan oneness with the Force. Remember, Palpatine told Anakin, if you want to understand the mystery, you have to study it, both sides of it. Not just the light side, you've got to come at it from both sides. Luke training. Not an incredibly successful lightsaber effect here. It does change colour, and the rotoscoping's not bulletproof. Another thing that benefits from the special edition buff up. Oh, Han. You will change your position. In The Force Awakens, Han Solo is mere feet away from this exact point on the ship when he tells Finn and Rey the Force is all true. That's a journey for that character. Very much looking forward to Galaxy's Edge. Is it Galaxy's Edge in the Disney parks when we get the Star Wars world? Be able to get there and get on board the Falcon and have a look around. This was all this set decoration, all the Greeblies. everything they did to this set was done by a chap named Roger Christian. Is it Roger Christensen or Roger Christian? He was first class at making this used universe stuff. He built the Graflex lightsabers as well. He did a great job of making this ship look tired and old and worn down, and like every square inch had been utilised at some point, even down to the little storage compartments being filled with items. If you watch closely here, David Prowse's actions are out of sync with James L. Jones's dialogue. It would have been very easy to put that right. Now, my understanding of the Falcon is that the reason it's one of the fastest ships is because it's got one of the best navigation computers. So, could it have not picked up on the destruction of Alderaan? I mean, obviously not, but if that's what makes this ship so powerful, how did it not detect that asteroid field? Great achievement to get those two models comped into one shot. You can just see when the Falcon drops in to that shot previously, the TIE fighter disappears, because comping those things together is technically very, very difficult. But obviously these things wouldn't be so much of a challenge today. This model of the Death Star, I don't think I've mentioned the Death Star yet, but this model, or the Death Star itself, was brought to life by a mixture of matte paintings and a model, and that model ended up outside of a store. Someone was using it almost like a waste paper basket, like a dustbin, rubbish, trash can, and a collector, Gus Lopez, found it and saved it, and it now lives in his home in a big glass case. Wonderful, beautiful piece of design. This space station's quite something, and to think that this was the small one. There's all these little shots, like the stormtroopers with their breathing packs on, standing outside by the turbo lasers. All those little shots, you miss them as they scream past, and every once in a while they just catch my attention. Oh yes, of course, that is definitely a thing. Oh, mouse droid. So there's no sign yet that Vader, or indeed Anakin, is sensing Obi-Wan. It takes proximity for him to be able to sense his old friend, his old master. What a great idea, these smuggling compartments. I found myself getting lost again then. In Radio, they call that dead air. in audio commentaries they call that, this film is great. I wonder if we'll see these compartments play a part in the Han Solo movie. An interesting little meme is, if you considering now, especially since The Force Awakens, when Finn finds Obi-Wan's bag, complete with the training drone, the lightsaber training drone in The Force Awakens, it sort of sets a stage for, well, there's been stuff on there for decades that hasn't been found. And of course, we never see the bodies of those two guys who go in to scan and the subsequent stormtroopers. We never see those bodies removed from the Falcon. So presumably, they're still stuffed in a compartment somewhere, decomposing, which is nice. Some of these blaster bolts, some of the shots that hit the Imperial officers, they've been dialed down in a special edition. So this version have great big squibs exploding, huge pyrotechnic effects. All of that stuff got dialed down in the special editions. Obviously, sensibilities have changed since the 70s, I think, when it comes to these things. There's an extraordinary amount of ADR in scenes like this. Additional dialogue recording or automatic dialogue replacement, depending on who you talk to. In a scene like this, where you've got Anthony Daniels and Kenny Baker inside prop costumes, and the guys, Harrison and Mark, inside the Stormtrooper, the fiberglass Stormtrooper suits, there's a lot of noise, a lot of clanking, a lot of banging and cracking of the plastic. All of that stuff had to be reduced, and you can't just reduce stuff like that in the mix. So they have sessions where they loop in dialogue over the top of what was already said, and it's kind of seamless. One thing they didn't loop in to these movies was the dialogue that Peter Mayhew spoke. Now, in that scene there, Peter says, "That old man's crazy," in his beautiful, soft voice. And, of course, they replace it with some of Ben Burtt's magical sound mixing. But it is quite fascinating when you hear characters like Chewbacca speak with a human voice, and when you hear Dave Prowse delivering the dialogue of Darth Vader in his West Country accent. It is quite amusing and makes for quite an interesting viewing. Perhaps with branching technology, that should be an option on a future release of these films, that we can just hear the raw audio. Clanks, Peter Mayhew, and West Country Darth Vader, and all. There are also plans quite early on to replace 3PO's dialogue with a different characterization. The idea at the time was to make him like a slick, almost like a used car salesman. If you've ever seen American Graffiti, there's a guy in that, Jerry, I think his name is. He's literally a used car dealer, and he's very slick and oily, and he's a bit of a creep. And I think that's what George imagined 3PO being. But Anthony Daniels personified this character in such a singular fashion that when they were trying to ADR, loop out the voice, it wasn't going anywhere. And somebody said to George, "Anthony's perfect, just use his voice." So he looped in his own dialogue. But they tried, I think it might have been Mel Blanc was brought in, the famous voice performer from cartoons. I think he may have been brought in to do a read, and it just wasn't working, because Anthony's presence is coming through that suit so effectively. You couldn't just record any old voice over the top and have it work. They're almost inseparable. It's a great moment. Chewie chasing off the mouse droid. I was glad to see those make it through to the later films, particularly Rogue One. It makes a lot of sense that they're present in that. No one's batting an eyelid at the Wookiee on board. Black Death Star droid wandering through there. So Obi-Wan now infiltrating the bowels of this space station and going unnoticed by all but his old student. I think that they're sensing each other at that point. Now, I believe that there was an optical illusion here, with the extension down that corridor. I think is all done a trick with a painting. But in the special editions, I think it's extended somewhat significantly, digitally. But of course, they didn't have the ability to do that back in the day. You're going to see some of those exaggerated blaster lands there, squibs and pyrotechnics. All of this is reduced greatly in the special editions. Wonderful chaos, and I do love the way Han reacts when he's talking to Control about the reactor leak. Yeah, I'm not sure they're pulling off that set extension, with that image. I'm not sure that's working. 2187. I love the way these numbers keep popping up. Great moment from Harrison Ford. I'd love to see the shooting script and see how much of this now is Harrison and how much is George. Because I can't imagine George writing those lines verbatim. Does it get any more iconic than that? Prisoner Leia. This is where Carrie, I think, almost single-handedly changed Hollywood. And that sounds like hyperbole, but when she exits that prison cell to go with the boys, she momentarily reverts to type. We'll swing back round to that, but so there we go. Vader revealing that Obi-Wan is present just as all hell breaks loose, and Tarkin is convinced. Obi-Wan also aware that something's happening. I'm sure that they're sensing the future changing around them now. Always in motion and all that. So this is where Leia reverts to type a little bit. The damsel in distress. She's still the firecracker. She's still got the whip smart dialogue, but it's here, hiding behind hiding behind the hero, almost like she's giving him a chance. I do think Carrie's portrayal of this character is wonderful. And this is the moment where she thinks these two hapless chaps are absolutely not going to do me any favours. Just momentarily reverts to type before taking command and showing just who is in charge. Absolutely wonderful. We're also coming up to one of my favourite Star Wars inconsistencies. So Luke drops down, probably hits about now. Han jumps in the chute, he hits. Now, there has not been enough time for Luke to try blasting his way out of this trash compactor. Yep, magnetically sealed. And you did not try, Luke. You're telling little lies. If you notice, Chewbacca, Peter Mayhew, stays up on a little ledge there by the door throughout this scene. He never once drops into the water. And that's quite simply because they only had the one suit. They couldn't afford to get the Chewbacca suit wet. They wouldn't be able to get it dried out between shots. So they decided to give Chewie a free pass and let him stand up on a ledge while everybody else had to deal with the water, the junk, and the Dianoga. This is a great idea. This seems to be typically George Lucas. Just when you think the heroes are at their absolute rock bottom, he takes it to another level and puts them through even more punishment. And clearly the Empire have pinpointed their location, engaged something that chases the Dianoga off and gets Luke a little reprieve. Mark had a blown blood vessel in one of his eyes during this scene from being under the water. So I think it actually restricted his ability on set for a little while there. Of course, worse luck would befall Mark before the end of this movie with an unfortunate accident. But we'll talk about that a bit later. So there we have. Boop, there's the little headbang from the stormtrooper. Many of the supporting cast have claimed to be that stormtrooper, but I think it was a chap named Laurie Good, if I remember correctly, and he hadn't been all that well, and so he'd misjudged that. He'd been, if this is true, it may be purely anecdotal, but he was somewhat under the weather. And so he wasn't exactly on his game. And then that moment was born. And of course, it made its way in later in audio design, in one of the later editions of the film. And it made its way into the DNA of Jango Fett in Attack of the Clones. This is a great classic RKO serial type cliffhanger of having your principals trapped in a room that's collapsing. We see it again. It pops up in one of the Indiana Jones films. It's a great callback to the sort of cinema that George and his contemporaries, people like Steven Spielberg, would have been watching these things in cinemas as children. And of course it made its way into their work later on. This is just the latest, or at the time, the latest iteration. They did well with these droids to avoid too many reflections of crew. That must have been a real chore to try and prevent picking up the camera crew and the lighting and the boom mic. Most of the menace of that scene was achieved through editing. First class stuff. George's wife at the time, Marcia, was released from, I think it was New York. She was working with Martin Scorsese. She was released to help George cut this, and they cut the movie pretty much around the clock. So George would do nights, Marcia would do days. They'd pass for bowls of soup and toasted cheese sandwiches, and then this film was crafted through those efforts. And that scene of the trash compactor, that was really sold through the editing. Those rapid pace edits, cutting from one shot to another, really managed to build up the tension. Here we're going to see an example of English text in Star Wars, which of course went on to be replaced by Urabesh later on, but the tractor beam labelling is all English in this scene. Obi-Wan out on a ledge, literally. And Leia setting out her stall. I get the feeling Luke's struggling to keep up at this point. So we get the exchange here. This has become somewhat of a meme itself. The exchange between the two stormtroopers discussing the new craft. I don't know if it's a former TIE fighter or a land speeder or something, but they're talking about the new PT-16, and this made its way into The Force Awakens when Sam Witwer and David W. Collins were doing additional dialogue recording for The Force Awakens, and they had a similar conversation. I believe also it made its way into Rogue One with two troops talking about the latest model of some sort of ship. And this moment also, Han and Chewie taking off after the stormtroopers, giving chase down the corridor. Absolutely wonderful. This is Keystone Cop style comedy, perfectly judged by George, with Chewie just stopping and waiting and turning tail and running. It's great. The charm of that moment as well, I think, is bolstered by the fact that there's half a dozen troops running from one guy and a Wookiee, and then realising, why are we running? They're outnumbered. it works beautifully when you have the restraint to just say have half a dozen troops, but the special editions really over eggs that pudding by having Han run into a conference room or something full of hundreds of stormtroopers and TIE fighters and Imperial officers. It's just over the top. I would love to be able to craft an edit of this film myself and get those subtleties back, the subtleties that George judged so well back in the day, get them back in and avoid some of the pitfalls of the special editions. This swing across almost didn't happen. One of the stuntmen was testing out the rig and something made a tearing sound, and Mark very nearly refused to do the stunt until the stuntman lied and said, "No, that wasn't the harness tearing. It was my trousers." Here we go. Obi-Wan knows it's on. Some of this stuff, at this point in the production, there were 3 units shooting. So George would have had the A unit. There'd be a B unit out there with his assistant director, and then the wonderful Robert Watts, whose signature, I'm happy to say, is on my wall 3 times. The wonderful Robert Watts, he oversaw some of the 3rd unit directing. So when R2 puts down his 3rd foot in a moment, that's Robert directing that. So there you can see the power lead sticking out of Obi-Wan's sleeve. Some of this footage gets flopped. Remember what I was saying about the editors having to use every single frame? Some of this stuff gets flopped, and you can see the information on the Darth Vader suit's chest, whether this is Bob Anderson or I think it's actually David Prowse. His costume, the information switches sides and becomes a mirror of itself, and that's because what the editors were doing at this point in the editing suite were flopping the negative over. So the information on the left moved to the right, and they get to essentially double their footage. And because it moves so rapidly, it's barely noticed. And if the design of the Vader costume had been perfectly symmetrical, there you can see the chest plate there has been reversed. If the Vader costume was symmetrical, then it wouldn't have even noticed. But because there's some asymmetry in that costume design, it calls attention to itself upon repeat viewing. I'm not sure how many people notice this stuff, but I do after years and years of looking for it, There was a cut scene here of our guys walking around with blasters behind their back, whistling, trying to look nonchalant, and in fact calling more attention to themselves. This is a tremendously important moment. Obi-Wan absolutely knows that he's not going to leave. That's the Robert Watts handiwork there. He knows he's absolutely not going to be leaving this space station. But he knows the act of self-sacrifice he's about to commit will do more to motivate Luke than escaping. He has now martyred himself before Luke. Luke sees Vader for what he is, which is a killer. Of course, we're going to get a moment here where Vader's lightsaber is white, not as we currently understand it, a healed kyber crystal, but more like a lack of rotoscoping. So Obi-Wan's now fully transitioned to become one with the Force and is already reaching out to Luke and giving him instructions. So the power of that sacrifice is twofold. He becomes something more for Luke. His sacrifice is is so much more significant because Luke witnessed it in person. That will now motivate Luke to take Obi-Wan's wishes more seriously, and he won't really question them until he finds out the truth about his father. And also, it transitions Obi-Wan from corporeal to non-corporeal form. He becomes one with the Force, and now everything he's been practicing in the desert for decades gives him access to Luke and gives him the opportunity to train Anakin Skywalker's son to help Anakin fulfill his destiny. Although Yoda and Obi-Wan seem to be a little bit misguided about what exactly they need to do to bring about the fall of the Sith. Fortunately, Luke has a little bit more faith in his father and his ability to return from the dark side than Yoda and Obi-Wan did. This is a great action scene. This, during pre-production, George needed to help ILM capture the footage they need. They'd spent a year and millions of dollars to cobble together one barely usable shot. So Lucas decided it would be best if he could cut together what we would now recognise as an animatic for the special effects artists to work from. So Lucas got World War II footage, dogfights, gunners in turrets on bombers from World War II films, and he cut them together, and it's astonishingly close to what ILM ended up producing. So it just goes to show that George, flying by the seat of his pants in terms of the budgetary restrictions he had, produces pure gold. Being able to sit down and cut together something, so look, just this is what I'm looking for, just do this frame for frame, and I'll have exactly what I want. And when you get to the prequels, and I'm not prequel bashing, but when you get to the prequels, and Lucas didn't have those limitations, he was both producer and director, and it was his money in the film. He didn't have these sorts of things motivating him. He had complete freedom. And I think he was better. I think he was better when he had limitations. I think it stimulated more creativity. So there, a nice little reveal that yes, they were released, and only Leia can see it. The hubris of Han Solo prevents him from seeing the truth that she can see, that Leia can see, that they didn't escape because of the genius of Han and the abilities of this ship. It was all part of the Empire's plan. We know now that some of this chemistry between Leia and Han was helped along by some of the chemistry between Harrison and Carrie in real life and their real life relationship at the time. But it enriches every scene that these two have together. And it's even more, it's exemplified still further in The Empire Strikes Back. It's just on fire. The chemistry between these two characters, these two performers, is just incredible. So there we have Yavin, a planet that gets a serious facelift in the special editions, and the fourth moon. So some of Ralph McQuarrie's concepts for Yavin have been have been repurposed or at least referenced in Han Solo. The entrance to the Massassi Temple there was dramatically different to the entrance in both Rogue One and the special editions of A New Hope. You know, for us now, if we were to watch these films consecutively, we were just here. We were just here with Mon Mothma. We were just here with Jyn and Cassian before that huge loss on Scarif. And this is the fulfillment of that mission, the journey to get these plans to this exact place at this exact time. This was Guatemala. Couple of guys from the production went down there, gaffer taped some lenses together, made some binoculars, macro binoculars. Now, the character sitting next to Wedge, excuse me, the character sitting next to Luke in this scene is Wedge. A pre-Dennis Lawson Wedge. I'm not sure why they recast, whether it was just simply the availability of this actor, but that's Wedge Antilles. So the next time we see Wedge, he's dramatically different. It looked almost like Tarkin had a little bit of doubt. I think he would have been happier if he'd been able to put this stuff to bed. This is all still echoes of Krennic's failure to Tarkin. I'm sure he would have wanted this all settled by now. So that's a similar offer to the offer Han makes to Rey in The Force Awakens. Luke, come and join me, join my crew. I wonder if Han is trying to put together a team like the one we're about to meet in the Han Solo movie next year. If they split in a less than harmonious fashion, with Han leaving with the Falcon, if that team was disbanded, Beckett, Lando and co., I wonder if it's always been Han's desire to put together another little team, another little crew of smugglers. This temple, this Massassi temple, Ralph McQuarrie had envisioned that the ships would float in the hangar bays because of some of the properties of the rock around them. I heard Paul Bateman talking about that recently I think it was on a Star Wars Influences. I really like the idea that these concept designers, these art directors, they've all made up their own mythology to explain some of the decisions they make. It's what gave us the design of Vader, that Ralph felt that there was a line in the script about the stormtroopers and Darth Vader coming from the Star Destroyer onto the Tantive V4 at the start of the movie. If they had to move through space, they would need breathing apparatus. So that's why the stormtroopers got those particular designs of helmets, and that's why Vader got that face mask, because he was going to be moving from one ship to another through the void of space, and that design stuck, motivated by some logic in the script, but went on to become something iconic of its own, and of course set about designing the fate of Anakin Skywalker much later on. Now, the X-Wing Squadron departing Yavin 4 looks much, much better in the special editions, much more details, gorgeous shots of those craft taking off. And also, if you watch closely in this edition, you'll see a lot of the shots of R2. He's no longer blue and silver, he's black and silver. For the same reason, these pilots are all calling in the red. There you see a black R2 there. They're all calling in red call signs because they couldn't be Blue Squadron. They were intended to be Blue Squadron, but the blue screen composites would mean the blue decals on the ships would disappear. So they were replaced with red. I love that effect of the ships passing through the magnetic field too. So there's Wedge. And now Dennis Lawson Wedge. So both those chaps make an appearance in Rogue One, which was skillfully done. As are these action scenes. Now, when you remember that these were done with models and motion control rigs, computer-driven cameras so that they can repeat the same pass over and over again and get the different elements that they need to composite, it's nothing short of incredible. Everything that had been done previously in by Kubrick in 2001, A Space Odyssey, working with John Dykstra and so on, it had all been so slow because of the limitations of the technology. But this really, John Dykstra managed to craft together a rudimentary computer that would give them so much freedom for multiple passes, controlled multiple passes. Some of these shots that are cut in are just starfields with green laser bolts going across them. It's quite charming. Yeah, this is quite incredible. All of these TIE fighters versus X-Wings. I mean, you'd probably be hard pushed to pick out in the special editions what are CGI ships and what are the models. It's done so well. If not quickly. If you look at the action scenes in Rogue One, at the end there of the battle over Scarif, the pace is breakneck for the modern audiences. And when sat alongside this, some of it seems quite slow. Obviously, we know now, we understand the call sign of Red 5 has only just been freed up in the Battle of Scarif. It did make me chuckle a little bit. So that actor was brought back to record additional dialogue for Rogue One, to add a line onto the end of that to make it make more sense. And we are in the canyon. That control room. When I first saw the images sneaking out of Rogue One that showed that control room with those map boards, it's just the attention to detail. It just really pinpoints you in a certain place and time. Some of these actors in their cockpits here were so lost at what they were being asked to do. Remember, George is primarily an editor, so all he was looking to do was gather the material he needed for his edit. He wasn't necessarily all that interested in giving the actors motivations for their characters. So he would sit an actor in the cockpit set and say, just speak your lines and we'll roll the camera. But many of the actors couldn't memorize all their lines without a particular cue. They're waiting for a cue, the other part of the exchange, to make sense of what comes next. They couldn't just remember the dialogue. They needed a cue to sort of trigger that the dialogue that they had learnt. George wasn't great at doing those things. Many actors who have worked with George, so he's not particularly an actor's director. He just thought you could sit and just recall your lines, just say your lines. So some of the actors in this scene had to write their lines on a piece of paper and have it on their leg so they could look down and read the dialogue line after line after line, which then George and his editors skillfully cut together to make it look like the exchanges were all being taken place naturally, because it was only one of these cockpits. It wasn't like there were a few of them in a circle and they're all playing off of each other. They're all filming independent of each other. But I think George really managed to pull that off. He gets a hard time a lot for that, taking that sort of approach to the craft. And lots of actors find that somewhat disappointing, that they're not given the opportunity to develop their characters or evolve their performances through interaction. Yep, just impacts on the surface. So this is the villain, seeming even more villainous to our hero as he's hunting down that X-Wing and destroying it mercilessly. These things that Luke witnesses, they really do galvanise him and his position within the rebellion very, very quickly. Wonderful. There are a couple of shots in this final approach down the trench, in the trench run, where, because of the limitations of composition, we're missing some of the some of the ships. Black R2 again. So there are 3 Imperial TIEs. There was only two X-Wing. So let's get Wedge out of the way so that we can just focus on Biggs and Luke in that canyon. It actually makes me wonder how far ahead of Wedge and Biggs Luke is in the trench. Are they deliberately holding back? So I don't think I've ever noticed that before. They're deliberately holding back so the TIEs have to deal with them first and buy Luke some time. And this is a beautiful moment. That's it. The Force Awakening. Oh, our hero R2. I can just imagine children's hearts breaking in theatres when that happened. Peter Cushing's superb in this film. The return of the hero. What a great moment. The ships heading back to Yavin and the explosion of the Death Star, without a doubt, hell of a lot better in the special editions. Much more going on. But this certainly gets the job done. So there you go. That's the Obi-Wan's exchange with Luke there. I think that's more about Luke's ability. It says more about Luke's ability than Obi-Wan's ability in the Force. And as Luke gets stronger within the Force, he finds it easier to connect with those who are at one with the living Force. So he starts to see Obi-Wan, not just hear him. And then throughout the passage of time through these films, we get to Return of the Jedi, he sees a more solid version of Obi-Wan. Does make me wonder how they're going to play with this in The Last Jedi. Will Rey, if in fact Yoda's Force Ghost is a part of the movie, will Luke see him as a solid blue ghost, the way he saw at the end of Return of the Jedi? And will Rey only hear the voice? Will she not be able to see what Luke sees? It's quite interesting. And the ceremony, of course. So here we have the real limitations of Star Wars. And right in the foreground here, as the camera cuts to behind our heroes, cardboard cutouts. Actual cardboard cutouts. Like a matte painting. It looks so incredibly cheap. It's one of the things that absolutely had to be addressed. And I can see why these things frustrated George so much. All of those people on hand, and they just didn't have enough to give George that wide angle. So they'd put in there a matte painting that makes the foreground characters of all things look like cardboard cutouts. Carrie Fisher winning the hearts of just about every young man and boy who watched this film, including me. Absolutely stunning. staggeringly beautiful woman. And the droids, of course, as good as new. All those breaking hearts have now been healed. R2 is back. What a wonderful ending to a movie. Most of the Star Wars movies end in their own unique way, and just giving us such a triumph at the end of this film was such a wise decision. Iris out. There we go. What a wonderful thing. And so that became the tradition for the Star Wars movies. At the ends of the first chapter are somewhat celebratory, with episode 1 ending with unification between the Gungans and the Naboo, and of course everybody smiling and awarding each other great big trophies. And the end of The Force Awakens, again upbeat with the destruction of the First Order's base. But as we have learnt, it would certainly appear that The Last Jedi is going to pick up where The Force Awakens left off, with the First Order swiftly making their presence felt in pursuing the Resistance down and chasing them off of Dakar. So there's where the true plaudits go. Film editors Paul Hirsch, Richard Chew and Marcia Lucas, who did a wonderful job cutting this movie in such an innovative way. It really gave this film its energy, its pace. They did extraordinary work with what was gathered for them by George during production. They did an absolutely wonderful job at editing this film together. What a cast. What a crew. Great stuff. Well, there's we spoke about him recently. There's Charles Lippencott's credit, publicity supervisor. He's the guy that got the word out about Star Wars way before it was even a thing. He knew how to take advantage of cons, get to the actual fans, get to the audience before it was even an audience. And of course, planet and satellite artist Ralph McQuarrie. What an unusual credit that is. Ralph McQuarrie creating the visual look of Star Wars, bringing this esoteric idea together to visually illustrate some of the themes George was going for to the people that needed to be parted with their cash. That's the guys at Fox, Alan Ladd Jr., and some of the money men, getting them to part with the money for a film like this, which, even though it was only something like 10 million at the time, it was an extraordinary gamble when most people saw this as a children's movie. This was almost like a TV movie, and from a director who had made kind of an art house, edgy sci-fi movie, and then this musical, American Graffiti. Why would they trust him with this huge budget for Star Wars? I think we can all agree they made the wise choice. Okay, so that's it. That's my solo walkthrough of the original edit of Star Wars, the pre-special edition of Star Wars. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that I sort of shared something perhaps you didn't hear, haven't heard elsewhere, some trivia from somewhere. I will hopefully get to do this again with the original versions of Empire and Jedi. But of course, our intention is to regroup and do a full-on Talk Star Wars feature comms for Rogue One next, and then finish out the OT with the Return of the Jedi. Thank you for joining me on this solo episode, which was quite the challenge, I don't mind telling you. I will look forward to coming back again in the very near future with something else. All right. Thank you very much for your attention and your patience on this episode. And I'll see you all next time. Talk Star Wars is a proud member of the Star Wars Commonwealth Podcast Network. Find us at starwarscommonwealth.com alongside
The Tumbling Saber Podcast,
The Generation X-Wing Podcast,
Rogue Squadron Podcast,
The Skyhoppers Podcast,
The TSW Roundtable,
The Nerd Room Podcast,
and San Diego Sabres Radio Podcast.
Head to starwarscommonwealth.com and take your first steps into a larger world.